In this talk, I want to pick up on some of the ideas I developed in my keynote speech this morning around the Anthropocene, and particularly to offer a new approach to thinking about the Anthropocene as a way of managing life in the present. So the book starts from a way of thinking about the Anthropocene as an antibiotic age. And by this, I'm developing an expansive idea of antibiotic beyond just particular drugs that are used to kill specific organisms, to think instead as the Anthropocene as the consequence of systematic efforts to control, rationalize, and simplify the dynamics of ecological and planetary systems. And we can think about this across a range of scales, from specific chemicals targeted at insects or bacteria, but right the way up to landscape scale interventions associated with the rise of industrial farming or industrial forestry that are based on the simplification, control, rationalization of ecological systems to produce surplus food. And likewise, efforts to control natural processes associated with flood management, fire suppression, even disease control, all of which have successfully domesticated and tamed the challenging elements of the non-human world that frustrated human flourishing in the past. And there's much to be celebrated from this antibiotic model. It's raised life expectancy, it's increased health, it's led to economic growth. But we also see a growing concern about what might be described as Anthropocene blowback. So a set of unforeseen consequences that have come about because of the excessive application of antibiotic modes of managing life. So just to provide a few examples, we could think about blowback on the microbial scale, growing concerns that the rise of intensive globalized agriculture leads to zoonotic diseases. H5N1, SARS, and potentially COVID are all associated with this concern about the excesses of intensive agriculture. Likewise, concerns about antimicrobial resistance, that antibiotics are ceasing to work well because of their overuse in agriculture. So that would be one manifestation of blowback. A second one more associated with humans and human health is a growing sense that the human microbiome, so the microbial composition of the human body, is fundamentally degraded and reconfigured by modern hygiene and health practices. So particularly in this case, the use of antibiotics is led by some microbiologists to lead to a widespread condition of dysbiosis, of ecological dysfunction within the human body associated with the rise of a set of allergic, autoimmune, non-communicative diseases, allergies, obesity, various cognitive dysfunctions. So another manifestation of blowback on the microbial scale. But arguably comparable developments are taking place on a landscape scale. So a sense that the excesses of agriculture, the excesses of forestry, the excesses of flood control and fire suppression have created dysfunctional conditions on a landscape scale that lead to extreme weather events, whether that's extreme flooding, types of extreme fires that we increasingly see around the world at the moment, the loss of biodiversity, the rise of plant diseases, all are indexed to the over-application of antibiotic modes of managing life. And this can arguably be scaled up to growing concerns expressed by climate scientists that I talked about in my talk this morning, that the planet itself is tipping out of the conditions of the Holocene that led to the flourishing of human life, and that we're moving fast into new planetary conditions associated with the Anthropocene as a consequence of the excesses associated with the great acceleration, with the overuse of resources and the exceeding of planetary boundaries. So the book takes this as its starting point, and it's interested in a particular set of responses that I describe as probiotic. And here probiotic again means much more than specific organisms that you might take, particular live bacteria you might take to address gut problems, towards a much more holistic way of thinking about efforts to use life to manage life. So efforts by scientists and policymakers to intervene into the dynamics of ecological systems in order to reset their circulation to deliver desired functions and services necessary for human survival. And the book works through a range of different manifestations of this, a range of examples on the microbial scale, people trying to reset gut ecologies through dietary practices, through various forms of fecal microbiota transplant, the replacement of unhealthy gut ecologies with more healthy gut ecologies, new frameworks of hygiene that try and recalibrate our relationships to dirt, to try and differentiate between good and bad germs in order that children can be exposed to the right sorts of microbes at the right point in the life course, various shifting gardening agricultural practices to do with integrated pest management, for example, which are about using the predators of particular undesired pests in order to minimize the use of herbicides and insecticides. So a range of deliberate interventions done in the context of Anthropocene blowback to try and reset ecologies to make them function. But the example that features most prominently in the book and that I'd like to focus on in the talk today happens at a landscape scale and is associated with a new approach to conservation, to land management, and even to agriculture that is described as rewilding. The flagship story of rewilding is around the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone in North America. Wolves went extinct from Yellowstone in the middle of the 20th century. They were reintroduced as a species conservation effort, but ecologists studying Yellowstone found that wolves exerted this effect on the food system, captured in this diagram here, such that they changed the grazing behavior of the large herbivores, the deer, the elk, the moose that lived in Yellowstone, which had these significant effects upon vegetation patterns. So the animals were eating differently, not so much because there were fewer of them because they were getting eaten by the wolves, but they were living in what ecologists describe as an ecology of fear. So the fear of predation by the wolf meant that the large herbivores grazed differently, and a small number of wolves had this landscape scale transformation of Yellowstone that led to the resurgence of desired forms of vegetation. So there's lots of interest in wolves in the rewilding movement and other what are called keystone predators, so predators that sit at the top of the food chain that exert this disproportionate influence over the ecologies that they're part of. There's also a lot of interest in the UK and in Europe in beavers. So beavers, once common across all of Europe, have gone extinct in many parts of Europe, but are now being actively reintroduced as what Jim Crumley, the nature writer, describes as nature's architects. So a sense that beavers, by virtue of the way in which they build dams, end up controlling the flow of water through river catchments, and in so doing deliver all sorts of desirable benefits for land managers. So in building dams, they can slow the flow of water, preventing extreme flooding events. They also retain water in the landscape so they can help to mitigate drought. Beaver dams are understood to help improve water quality, as well as to deliver wetland habitats that are very good for biodiversity. So there's this interest in restoring beavers as engineers, as ecological engineers that will deliver desired landscapes. And perhaps the most bizarre but high-profile version of rewilding is a proposal by two Russian zoologists, Sergei and Nikita Zimov, to de-extinct, to bring back from extinction, the mammoth. And they argue that the mammoth is required in order to manage the tundra landscapes of Siberia, which are fast melting, and in their melting, they risk releasing a huge amount of stored methane into the atmosphere, which will accelerate climate change, accelerate the transition from the Holocene into the Anthropocene, and that to bring back the mammoths will trample the snow, they'll create this insulating blanket, makes the mammoth the proper tool to fight global warming, they propose. So just another example of this way of thinking probiotically, that you could use life to manage life, to deliver desired systems and services. In this case, planetary stabilization, but we could think of it right down to the micro scale and the use of particular beneficial microbes to reset gut ecologies. And rewilding has captured the imagination of policymakers. There are great visions here expressed by the organization Rewilding Europe that policymakers could make use of land abandonment, the cessation of agriculture in many marginal parts of Europe, to restore charismatic megafauna, to create much more biodiverse, much more functional landscapes. So it's a very compelling vision, it's a very optimistic vision, but it's also a vision that tells us interesting things about the place of people in nature in the Anthropocene. So the first of which, it's a vision which very much sees humans as engineers. There's a version here of the human as the archetypal hyper-keystone species, the architect that can plan planetary survival through an ecological lens, that humans equipped with technology can manage the behaviors, the activities of keystone species like wolves and beavers, that they can use heavy machinery to remove invasive, undesired species, to reset ecologies so that natural processes can flourish, but also that humans may be involved in lethal control of overabundant herbivores in places where it's hard to restore wolves, let's say. So this is very much an anthropogenic vision in which humans will control the planet to enable planetary survival. Secondly, it very much values a subset of species that are held to be useful, hardworking engineers. In this picture here, which was to promote a documentary from Nature, from the Public Broadcasting Service in the US, we get this nice caricature of the beaver as the ultimate keystone species. It turns up on time, it works hard, it doesn't need to get paid, it doesn't take a holiday, it doesn't join a union. It is, if you like, from a particular capitalist vision, it is the ideal type of nature worker. So this is a tool that will deliver ecosystem services, and that's great for beavers, it's great for wolves, but of course there's a range of species that aren't especially useful, that are perhaps functionally redundant, and hence may well drop out of a probiotic vision in which life is optimized to deliver things that are useful for people. So we need to think about the ethics of this in terms of which forms of life are valued and which forms of life are discarded. And then, of course, there are a range of interesting geographies as to where in the world the probiotic turn is happening and who are exposed to some of the risks associated with the return of charismatic megafauna in this case. So just to give an example of tigers in the Sundarbans in Bangladesh, tigers are globally rare, but they are locally abundant in places in the deltas of Bangladesh, in which they threaten the lives of fishers, shown here wearing masks on the back of their heads as a way of trying to deter tigers from attacking them. So there are quite unequal geographies of where in the world the probiotic turn happens and the distribution of benefits to different people. We could think about that in the case of rewilding closer to home in Europe. So we hear a lot of optimistic stories about the resurgence of wildlife in parts of Scandinavia, in parts of Central Europe, as a consequence of the globalization of agriculture. So we increasingly grow our food in the tropics, and as a consequence, we're seeing large-scale deforestation of parts of the tropical world, which is allowing the resurgence of wildlife in temperate climes. So there's a bigger question about the distribution, the geographical distribution of the benefits of this shift in land management that need thinking through. But just to conclude, where I'm going in the book is really to try and explain how this probiotic thinking does offer us an optimistic, transformative vision of how life might be conceived and managed in the Anthropocene, in which across a range of scales, from the microbial interventions around human health and environmental health, right up to the landscape scale, planetary scale interventions associated with rewilding, there is a vision here in which ecological science could inform new models of policy and new forms of governance to help address some of the challenges associated with surviving in the Anthropocene in the present.